And for his insights on marine deployments to the Gulf and potential U.S. boots on the ground, we have Rod Martin, chairman of the Institute for the American Future and board member for the Center for Security Policy. So, Rod, thank you for joining us today. Always great to speak with you. There's some discussion about whether U.S. troops will be sent to Iran. Of course, Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying today that all U.S. objectives in Iran can be achieved without any boots on the ground. So just what do you make of this situation? Your overall thoughts on this war right now?
Well, that's exactly right. We can probably achieve all of our objectives without a single soldier entering Iran. And yet it's always good to have options. And it keeps the enemy off balance to have them there. It is a good thing for the Iranians to not know what Donald Trump is doing. So we had a fire on the USS Ford, which is our most advanced supercarrier, absolutely the finest ship in the fleet. And it didn't have anything to do with enemy action. It was just a random fire like you might have in your kitchen. Well, it had to pull out of the Red Sea and go for repairs. So the United States Navy is sending the USS Boxer and its amphibious ready group. We were already sending the USS Tripoli, which is an America-class LHA that has its own amphibious ready group, and we're queuing up the 82nd Airborne. So we're going to have about 8,000 airborne and Marines ready to deploy at need. And that's clearly not enough to invade a country, but it absolutely is enough to capture key islands Iran is using in the Strait of Hormuz to blockade traffic and potentially take and hold Karg Island, where 90% of Iranian oil exports ship through.
What do you think about President Trump extending again the deadline or the pause on attacks on Iranian energy infrastructure? It was originally 48 hours, and then it was 5 days, and now it was 10 days. President Trump is saying that he's having negotiations with the Iranian regime, saying that Iran is begging to have a deal. What are your thoughts on this situation, President Trump's talks?
Well, we should always assume that whatever Donald Trump does in terms of negotiation will seem scattershot to the people observing. But the president always has a plan, and we've seen how he does this in his own writings, starting with The Art of the Deal in 1987 and 12 books since. So we know how he thinks, we know what he's doing, we can infer what's happening in the negotiations. And it's very clear there's not a unified Iranian government at this point. We've been talking about this mosaic defense, which greatly decentralizes control over various military operations. But the truth is, we have fragmented the regime dramatically just by decapitating a huge percentage of the senior leadership. So now you have different centers of power. And the most important among those, in my view, going forward is the Artesh, which is the regular Iranian army. It has history going back to ancient Persia, basically, versus the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which is the primary tool of the Islamic regime. We have been very careful not to attack the regular army. We have been attacking IRGC forces. There's a reason. And my guess is the president is negotiating with somebody who is either from the regime itself or possibly from the regular army to bring about a transition. I really don't think this president is going to let this regime continue to survive.
Okay, I'm glad you said that this administration doesn't want the Iranian regime to survive, because what I'm wondering here, and by no means am I saying I'm an expert on this, but if you're trying to eliminate this regime and then you're talking to this regime, does that in some way sort of validates this regime that you're trying to destroy?
No, I don't think it does. And an example of that from not that distant history, this was in the 80s. In Haiti, we had a dictator for a very long time named Baby Doc Duvalier. And his father had been Papa Doc Duvalier. He'd been the dictator for decades before Baby Doc. We entered negotiations surreptitiously with Baby Doc because we wanted to remove him from power. And we had to have discussions to make that happen without invading. We didn't have the kind of technology we have now where you can just drone strike individual guys like we're doing all over Iran. So we negotiated with Baby Doc to get him to leave the country, and we got him a villa on the French Riviera, and he lived in style till he died. Okay, that's not a satisfying outcome. He was a bad guy. He was a mass murderer, much like these IRGC guys. But sometimes the most effective option is to give these guys a graceful exit so that you can restore some reasonable situation in the country. And in Iran, I think we've got a real shot at a free Iran with a democratic government. I think that's what the president is aiming for. I know that's what he wants. I think we're pretty close to getting to somewhere where that's actually possible.
Okay, can we get your analysis on what Iran is doing in these negotiations? Its plan here, because it's on one hand, President Trump is saying that these negotiations are going well, and then you hear from the Iranian state media or whatever media that it's denying these negotiations are happening, and then we hear President Trump saying the other day in his cabinet meeting that Iran is sending what President Trump described as a present by allowing 10 tankers to go through the Strait of Hormuz. So on one hand, you see positive actions from Iran. On the other hand, it's denying these negotiations are happening. What is Iran doing?
Well, it's a mistake to disbelieve the president. And the New York Times and CNN played that game for a good bit of this week and just had to eat crow, because then the Pakistani government confirmed that everything the president had said had been true. I don't know exactly who we're negotiating with. It certainly isn't an Ayatollah who isn't alive anymore, or his son who doesn't seem to be in communication with anybody. We are probably negotiating with a faction of the existing power structure. And presumably, this administration believes that they could sway enough of the regime's power in the direction of a proper transition to be meaningful enough to talk to. They clearly were able to get these tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, so they obviously have some degree of power, and we'll see where that goes. But at the end of the day, you see what we're doing on the ground. You know, we're now into our second week of drone strikes on individual IRGC checkpoints in the streets of Tehran and other cities. And what that does is something in previous wars you'd have had to do with individual snipers and hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground. No, we're taking out the bad guys who just a couple months ago were mowing down 36,000 peaceful Iranians in the streets. We're taking these guys out one by one, both Israel and the United States. And at some point, the regime just breaks. At some point, there aren't enough enforcers to overcome the people. And the president's been very clear. We don't want the Iranian people to come out of their houses and put themselves in harm's way until we give the signal. Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince, the son of the former Shah, has been saying the same thing. That signal hasn't gone up yet, so it's clearly the administration's take that in fact, we haven't done enough of this job yet. But we heard yesterday that we have now struck 10,000 targets in Iran. That's extraordinary for any war ever, and it tells you that we're getting very close to the end.
And Rod, you're right in saying it's a mistake to disbelieve President Trump. And I was talking to another guest about this the other day, and I said to him, if I had to choose a side to believe in, I'm not going to believe in the Iranian regime. I'm going to believe in what the U.S. is saying. I mean, obviously. But let me ask you one last question here, Rod. How do we know, okay, if this regime agrees that it's not going to develop nuclear weapons, how do we know it's going to follow up on that promise?
I don't think that this regime will ever tell the truth about anything. So I don't think that's what we're really negotiating for. I think we're negotiating their exit. And I think there is a compelling case for them to take that exit on this simple ground. the Iranian people will string them up from the nearest lamppost like Ceausescu in Romania if they don't actually leave. So I think that's what we're negotiating for. But if in the alternative we actually are negotiating for some semblance of this government continuing and a halt on the nuclear weapons program and a halt on the intercontinental ballistic missile program, okay, so be it. That's going to require a shocking number of inspectors, and they're going to have armed escorts. That's why I think the president isn't doing it, because it would commit us to having forces in region for a long time. I think it's the president's aim to bring about an allied Iran where we don't have to have a lot of forces in the region and we can reconcentrate on China and the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, Rod, always great to hear your insight. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you.